The Verge uploaded a video, which thankfully has been removed, showing a PC build guide that is the equivalent of making a $2,000 doorstop. In this video, I'll count every single one of their mistakes and correct them.
You can build a gaming desktop for around $1,000, but I want to go all out, so I spent around $2,000.
The amount of money spent on this PC are either a straight lie or a scam. The parts he got are nowhere near $2,000 combined. If he paid $2,000, he really should have put his money somewhere else.
Some tweezers to tighten up the wires.
Zip ties are not tweezers.
A Swiss Army knife, which hopefully has a Phillips head screwdriver in it.
Get a real screwdriver and not a pocket tool that you don't even know if it has a screwdriver in it, let alone a correct type and size.
And last but not least, an anti-static bracelet, which is to protect you and the parts.
Not an anti-static bracelet, there's no grounding wire.
And now we're really going to start building by adding the motherboard in.
It is a very bad idea to install the motherboard first thing. Anything smaller than a mid-tower is usually extremely difficult to do, and it's just always a good idea to get as much on the motherboard as you can before putting it into the case. Way easier.
Pay close attention to the brace that goes at the back of the computer.
I/O shield, not a brace.
You always have to make sure that you really hammer it in.
Do not hammer in an I/O shield. Too much force could scratch or even snap the metal on it, not to mention damage to the case.
Open the slots first, and just aligning the stick.
No need to open all DIMM slots. Read your motherboard manual so you know where to put your sticks.
For two main reasons. One, it has LEDs, and we do like lights in our gaming desktops. Secondly, it's pretty fast RAM. It's 2666 megahertz, I believe, so it's pretty fast.
2666 megahertz is very slow for DDR4 memory. Not to mention the fact that RGB shouldn't be a main selling point for the RAM you choose.
And this motherboard supports that speed, which is most important.
I have never seen a motherboard that doesn't support 2666 megahertz. Considering it as a baseline for a speed, not supporting 2666 megahertz would make all 3000 megahertz sticks and above useless.
With the middle,
you can see here that he's putting in the RAM backwards. Look at the notch on his stick compared to where the slot actually is. I know the quality is bad, but this is the best I can get.
Of the strip, not with the end, and just lining that up with the logo. So once you hear that solid clasp and you don't see the gold connectors on the side anymore, that's when you know the RAM is in.
Notice how here he's in slot 2, but when they cut away from the shot, he's in slot 1. And then when they cut back, he's in slot 4. Did you try slot 3?
Step 3, we're going to install the hard drive.
Look at this closely. He puts his sticks in slot 3 and 4, so dual channel memory support will not work on this system. He will only have 8 gigabytes of 2666 megahertz, so he already has the speeds of a 4-year-old laptop, as opposed to a cutting-edge $2,000 desktop this is supposed to be.
Swap it out, and it's only held down by one screw and the latch, so it's really simple and really straightforward. Speed for gaming is important when it comes to a hard drive. You want files to write quickly, and you want games to load quickly, so that's why it's best if you use an SSD.
Look here, he doesn't even have the standoff for his NVMe SSD in his motherboard. He screws this thing down straight onto the screw, bending the connector downwards. Do not do this ever, you're probably going to break something.
Now, which lane you choose depends entirely on what other parts you're going to put in the system. I'm just going to pick the top one because the SSD is at the bottom and I don't want to cover it. I just think it looks nice.
Completely wrong. While it is correct to use the top slot in this case, the slot you choose relies on the bandwidth of your system. It doesn't matter what parts are where, because your GPU covering your SSD won't do anything. If you have an SLI or Crossfire motherboard like mine, then you are fine to use both, but you pick the top PCI Express slot because of the bandwidth. Using the bottom slot will make your GPU slower in some areas.
So all you have to do is take the brick and make sure that you align it with these little insulating pads so that the power supply doesn't short circuit and come into contact with the rest of the system.
This was the clip that made me think this video was a joke. PSUs are grounded, and it touching a metal case won't do diddly squat to your precious RGB RAM you bought at AliExpress. Those are vibration bad, so your PSU, which will combust in a week, won't make noise.
So just take it in, slide it in nice and easy until you have a snug fit, and then shift it to the back and make sure it's right up against the frame.
This is the most dangerous part of the entire build, potentially a fire hazard. The PSU fan is facing inward, which will suffocate airflow and will be a serious problem for this PC because it might explode. Never ever face your PSU fan inward.
Always be sure to try to
look closely here. He hasn't mounted his fans on the radiator. You can see through the fins, so he's putting on a radiator without a fan.
It's in perfectly, and we're gonna start screwing it in.
He's just leaving the AIO hanging on the table. If it falls over, the AIO will get dirty and the thermal paste will go everywhere.
So there's nothing special about this screwing in process. They're just really long screws because they go through the entire frame of the cooler, and they take forever.
Wrong screws here, mainly because he forgot the fans. Those screws could cause damage to the radiator. The fluids will short your components, just like your power supply would if your case didn't have those insulating pads.
So next up, cables. Every power supply is going to come with a big bag of Velcro cables.
Nope, only modular supplies include those cables. Considering this is a guide, it would be good to mention the 3 types of PSUs there are. In case you didn't know, there's modular, semi-modular, and non-modular. He has a modular PSU, and both modular and semi-modular will include these cables, while non-modular will not.
Matching that cable from the motherboard, threading it through the back, and attaching the 24-pin header.
Notice how he said thread it through the back, but he still has the majority of the 24-pin connector in the main portion of this case. I'll come back to the rat's nest of cable management in a bit.
We're just going to take this little plastic part out. We'll just toss that out of here.
Do not throw away the plastic covering. Motherboard manufacturers that have that covering need that should you need to RMA your motherboard. Considering this PC is going to become a tabletop Hindenburg in a couple days, he shouldn't have thrown that away.
And now we have an exposed CPU holder, or rather slot,
Socket.
on the motherboard. And we're going to use the CPU applicator. This is a special little part that not everyone...
By pushing the CPU into the tool from the back where the pins are, he is risking serious damage that can stop it from working altogether.
may get, but this motherboard that we got from ASUS definitely does have. It's called a CPU installation tool. It makes it really useful if you want to install a Core i7 hexa-core CPU. Yeah, we've got one, and it's an 8th generation chip.
Yeah,
and
we got one. Super exclusive. You can only buy it on every major retailer in the world.
And it's ready to go, and it supports overclocking. So what having this little installer does for you is it's basically a brace that you can apply right to the CPU and light it up with the triangles that you'll see on the bottom left corners. And this will make it easier for us to apply it to the motherboard and then apply thermal paste and then apply a CPU cooler on top.
He spent a lot of time talking about this tool that nobody uses, only to put it on the table and not use it. Also notice how he has his phone flashlight on and used it, because it's difficult to install a CPU into a motherboard that's in a case.
So we're about to apply thermal paste to the CPU.
You don't need thermal paste because your AIO already has some on it.
Every CPU cooler actually comes with a bit of thermal paste already neatly applied in a circle around it.
Not every cooler comes with thermal paste, and not all of them have it in a circle either.
But it's usually not enough.
It is enough.
Extra and layer it on top of the CPU. The final portion is to add the CPU cooler to the top end of the processor. So
Look how much thermal paste he put on. He drowned his IHS in this stuff, and by smushing his AIO onto the CPU, some thermal paste might seep out and permanently destroy some of the pins on the motherboard. It would be smart to RMA your motherboard when that happens, but you already threw away the required component that you made look useless.
and they're going to keep the cooler raised off the processor, but it's also going to be close enough to actually physically come in contact with it, like basically keep it cool.
If your AIO didn't come into contact with the CPU, how would it cool the CPU? Those brackets you were talking about are for mounting your cooler raised off of the motherboard directly, but touching the CPU.
Take thumb screws like this and just screw them on.
Later we see that he missed a thumb screw on his AIO, which in that case, his AIO might fall off, hit, and definitely break something.
You need a USB flash drive with your Windows installation media on it, and of course a license key.
You don't need a license key for Windows. You can just download an ISO and never activate Windows. License keys are expensive unless you're a thug and use G2A.com like me, which I recommend.
And it's running pretty smoothly. Like, I'm averaging 70 and 80 FPS, and this is normally like a very intensive game to run. And it's still doing a pretty good job.
That's not smooth at all. 1080p at 70 FPS is something that my system with an RX 580 could do for max settings in Overwatch. This is not a graphically demanding game.
So right now I'm playing League of Legends.
League of Legends is not a good benchmark. The minimum requirement for that game is a single core CPU.
I'm averaging 120 FPS, and that's only because I've actually locked the game to that frame rate.
This is a benchmark, so why did you lock your frame rate? If you're trying to prove your benchmark, then unlock the FPS so we can see how many frames you're actually getting. In this case, 120 seems to be all he needs, but I don't think he's getting more than 120 FPS if he's locked his frame rate. Not an honest benchmark. Now I'm going to point out some of the things that aren't necessarily errors, but are criticisms of the video in general. First thing, he said this.
So, what do you need to build a desktop? Well, of course, first you need a table.
You don't need to point that out. Everyone is going to need a working space of some sort. It's common sense, you don't need to say that.
A thermal paste applicator.
You don't need a thermal paste applicator to put on thermal paste. Just put a small, roughly pea-sized drop on the IHS, which is the center of the CPU, and then put on your cooler. It will spread out accordingly, and that is more than enough. Some coolers will come with thermal paste pre-applied, like the AIO he has.
An Allen wrench.
I have built a PC before, I know tons of people who have, and I've never seen an Allen wrench be needed to build one. Unless the reason he is using it is to assemble the table, in which case, go grab one.
Isolate the parts that you really need.
What do you mean by isolate the parts you really need? You're going to need every item you mentioned except for the nonsense tools you put in there for whatever reason.
Place items into the case and make sure that they all fit.
You should know if your components fit in your case or are compatible with one another before you buy your parts. For example, don't buy DDR3 for a DDR4 board, don't get an Intel CPU for a Ryzen board, etc. As for size, it's really easy to tell if your components will fit in your case before you buy them. Just look at the specifications.
I chose Asus's Z370 motherboard for two main reasons. One, it has built-in Wi-Fi and Bluetooth.
Do not buy a motherboard just because it has Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. Unless you are a thug and use the ASRock X370 Killer SLI motherboard like me, those motherboards usually come at a high price for little benefit.
This is from Kingston, and it's 480 gigabytes, so it's not a lot, but you can always upgrade this and swap it out.
480 gigabytes was a poor choice for an SSD. I actually found the SSD he used, which is on screen, and it's 500 megabytes per second. If you're booting off of an SSD like this, your Windows will be really slow. Also, he mentioned that SSDs can be swapped out, which is true, but you will need to get a new installations of Windows and a new license key because that is his only storage device. Instead of using this SSD, be a thug and get the WD Black SN750 NVMe 1TB SSD like me. Not only is it twice the capacity, but it is 7 times faster. All of this for only $77 more at Best Buy. This way, you can actually get a true premium PC. Last thing, this PC build is a scam. I put my own PC build together and crunched the numbers, and the total came down to $1,878 for a better PC. This includes a faster processor, a 1080 Ti, twice the RAM at an actual fast speed of 3200 MHz, a 2TB SSD at 3.5 GB per second, an X570 motherboard, and a 750 watt power supply. The only disadvantage is that it doesn't have Wi-Fi, so that might be a deal breaker. Otherwise, thank you for watching and don't build a PC like Stefan.